Let's discuss our nation's 7th president, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. Jackson's path to the presidency began with his loss in the 1824 presidential election to John Quincy Adams. While Jackson had more support in the election, he did not have a clear majority of votes, sending the election to Congress to be decided by the House of Representatives, controlled by Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Clay convinced enough House members to bring victory to Adams, outraging Jackson's supporters who thought Jackson should be president. When Clay was later named Secretary of State by Adams, Jackson's supporters called it a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. These events reshaped the American political landscape, splintering the old Republican Party. Jackson joined one group, which became the Democratic Party, and promoted a limited government. The Whig Party, led by President Adams, wanted a strong federal government and favored government support of the economy through building projects. Adams promoted building many new canals and roads, as well as a national university and an observatory. But these proved to be a tough sell to both Congress and to a public that was increasingly embracing the idea of a limited government. An inspirational leader, Jackson ran on the limited government platform of the Democratic Party in the election of 1828. His presidential campaign had all the popular support of his previous campaign and more. During the 1820s, the spirit of democracy grew in the United States as more white men gained suffrage, or the right to vote. Previously, only landowners had the right to vote, but as more states were added to the Union, some of the newer states began granting the right to vote to farmers and laborers who did not own land. Many of these voters supported Jackson. The spread of political power to more people was part of what became known as Jacksonian democracy. When Jackson won the election, it was widely cheered as a victory for common people. The new spirit of democracy had another effect on the two new political parties, as each developed a more democratic selection process for their presidential candidates. After the 1828 election, the two parties began to hold nomination conventions, where each party's candidate for president was selected by delegates representing each state. One of the most dramatic changes to take place in the first days of the Jackson presidency was creation of the spoils system to reward some of the Democrats who helped elect him. The spoils were government jobs. Previous presidents had made a few appointments as they entered office, but Jackson fired more than 200 government employees and filled the positions with political friends. Jackson said he believed he was serving democracy by allowing ordinary men to fill jobs that previous presidential appointments had filled only with wealthy men. One of Jackson's supporters described the system as, "To the victor belong the spoils." Do you think the spoils of government should belong to the victor of a public election?
Lesson 1. Jackson wins the presidency. During the early 1800s, a growing spirit of democracy changed the political system and affected American ideas about social classes. The main cause stemmed from the influence of Andrew Jackson. He was an American politician during this time who supported expanding democratic rights. From the time of his first campaign for president in 1824 until his death in 1845, he dominated American politics. Jackson's policies had a significant effect on issues such as voting rights and the ways in which government functions. This period is often known as the Age of Jackson. Get ready to read. Startup. Look at the image of Jackson's 1824 inauguration celebration. What can you conclude about the kind of people who supported Jackson? Write a few sentences, summarize.
Okay. What you should see from this picture is you've got some rich folks down here. You should be able to tell because they're wearing these fancy things and looking stylish. They've got canes, but the rest of them, especially in the back, they're dressed in different colors. The guys over here have big, heavy jackets, probably made by themselves. They're supposed to represent common folks. Even up here in the middle of the picture, you've got some folks in carts drawn by horses, carriages, and they might be rich just like these people in the back. But as you can see, this horse is wild and crazy. And the idea that these common, poorer folks were supporting Jackson weren't the rich, upper class people who normally were voting. They were a little bit wilder and crazier, and It kind of scared Washington, D.C. to see these people being allowed to participate. Okay, I'm going to skip forward in the reading a little bit. The top part, kind of not important. It says everybody in America basically felt like they were somewhat equal to the upper crust. Even the poorest people didn't think rich people were better than them. Very different from in Europe, where if you're rich, you're wealthy, that means you're a better person than the poor people. And so this guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, writes a book about how it's very different in America. And we're going to come down to here, increased suffrage. The section talks about who has the right to vote.
In it, he admired the American democratic spirit so far. But overall, he found that the results of the social revolution taking place in America, while still far from coming to an end, were already incomparably greater than anything at the age of Jackson. More Americans gained suffrage, or the right to vote. Others, however, were denied full participation in the growing democracy. The United States was growing rapidly. New states were joining the Union. This growth fed some of the sectional divisions among states over taxes, trade, and other interests. People in the North, South, and West differed in their views on these issues. Despite these disagreements, the regions grew more alike in their eagerness to expand voting rights to nearly all white men and to strengthen democracy. There were many citizens eager to participate in elections. Some of the first states to give voting privileges to white males who did not own property were in the West. In these states, any white man over age 21 could vote. Reformers in the East worked to expand suffrage in that region. By the 1830s, most eastern states had dropped the requirement that voters had to own land. In this way, laborers, artisans, and craft workers, and shopkeepers gained the right to vote. Throughout the country, growing numbers of Americans exercised their newly acquired right to vote. Before 1828, the turnout of eligible voters was never more than 27%. That low percentage rose to nearly 58% in the election of 1828. By 1840, voter turnout was nearly 80%. Limits on suffrage. Despite the nation's growing democratic spirit, a great many Americans did not have the right to vote. These included women, Native Americans, and the vast majority of African Americans. Meanwhile, even through Jackson's presidency, a few states kept the requirement that only white male property owners were eligible to vote. Although most white men had won suffrage, free African Americans had lost it. In the early years of the nation, most northern states and a few southern states allowed free African American men to vote. By the 1820s, however, many of these states had taken away that right. By 1830, only a few New England states permitted free African American men to vote on equal terms with white men. In New York, African American men had to own property in order to vote, while white men did not. No state allowed enslaved African Americans to vote. Reading check. Summarize. How did democracy expand during the age of Jackson?
Okay, I can answer that a little bit. It expanded a lot for white men. Originally, most states said you had to be white, a male over a certain age, and you had to own property. I mean, really only the rich could vote. That was a very small section of society. And a lot of these different groups, areas of the country are expanding rights to white men that don't own property, to younger white men. And so white males are getting more rights. African Americans, it's interesting, they had in most states at the beginning of this country the right to vote, and it was getting taken away. However, in some northern states like New York, African American men could vote if they owned property, but the rules were different. As you can see here, white men did not have to own property in New York, whereas African Americans did. I also wanted to have everybody look at this line here. And the reason I put it in pink is because it's about women in my head. A great many Americans did not have the right to vote. This included women, Native Americans, and the vast majority of African Americans. As we're going forward, we're going to see in the United States things get very ugly and very racist in a way that we can't even imagine today. I know there's big movements about racial equality, but what we're facing today is nothing like what happened in the 1800s, where, if you see here, rights are literally being stripped from African Americans, and slavery is a huge, huge problem. The 1860s, we have a war about it. And after the 1860s war, there's a lot of fighting trying to get rights for African Americans, African American men. Native Americans are going to be fighting for their rights, men. There's going to be a huge wave of immigration coming in from different countries, Italy, Mexico, China, just to name a few. And they are going to have to fight for their rights. But as they are all doing this, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexicans, Italians, so on and so forth, they're all thinking about how do we get more rights for our men, and women are left out of that. And in the 1920s, about 1920s, women are going to have to fight for the rights that they should be getting all along, separate from all the racial stuff. And this chart up here kind of tells the story very quickly and very easily. In the blue part, it says, who cannot vote or serve on juries? All women. And I wish I could highlight it, but I can't. Who can own property? Single white women. Who can't own property? Married women. That was a huge problem for women, because if you are lucky enough to inherit stuff because your family is wealthy, or you work really hard and you build up a little empire and you buy land and you are doing good for yourself, ladies, you have to choose, do I get married or not? Because if you get married, your new husband gets all that stuff. You get none. You lose it. So women, I don't have an end point here, but you need to realize that when we're talking about going forward in this class, people fighting for rights from the 1860s to 1920s, it's usually about men getting their rights, and women are treated even separate from that. Anyways, I'm going on to the next section. Okay, this timeline is interesting. I'll be talking about it. I'll be stopping the video, and it just says, different states had different rules about who could vote. But what you need to understand is more people are being allowed to vote, and these more people are starting to look at Andrew Jackson. Okay, the election of 1824 and a corrupt bargain.
The election of 1824 leads to a bargain. There were 4 candidates for president in 1824. All 4 were members of the old Republican Party. However, each had support in different parts of the country. John Quincy Adams was strong in New England. Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson had support in the West. William H. Crawford was favored in the South, but became too ill to campaign. The candidates. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts was the son of Abigail and John Adams, the second president. A graduate of Harvard University, the younger Adams had served as Secretary of State and helped end the War of 1812. People admired Adams for his intelligence and high morals. In 1821, as Secretary of State, he gave a 4th of July speech before Congress. It set the tone for American foreign policy for decades to come. Adams, however, was uncomfortable campaigning among the common people. In fact, to most people, he seemed hard and cold. Henry Clay, a Kentuckian, was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a skillful negotiator and a shrewd politician. Despite his abilities, Clay was less popular than the other candidate from the West, Andrew Jackson. William H. Crawford had served as Treasury Secretary, War Secretary, and Ambassador to France after the War of 1812, and as a senator from Georgia. Crawford's support was concentrated in the Southeast. To many Americans, especially on the Western frontier, Andrew Jackson was a hero. A general during the War of 1812, he had defeated the British and a group of Creek Indians who were allied with the British. He had gone on to defeat the Seminoles and the Spanish in Florida, gaining that territory for the United States. He was known as the hero of New Orleans for his victory in the War of 1812. He also earned the nickname Old Hickory, after a soldier said he was tough as hickory. Jackson's fame as a general helped him launch a political career. Although he was a landowner and a slave owner, many saw him as a man of the people. Jackson had been born in a log cabin, and his parents had been poor farmers. He was admired by small farmers and others who felt left out of the growing economy in the United States. The expansion of the vote to white men without property helped account for Jackson's political popularity. The corrupt bargain. No clear winner emerged from the election of 1824. Jackson won the popular vote, but no candidate won a majority, or more than half of the electoral votes. As a result, under the provisions of the Constitution, the House of Representatives had to choose the president from among the top 3 candidates. Because he had finished 4th, Clay was out of the running. As Speaker of the House, though, Clay played an important role in influencing the results. He urged members of the House to vote for Adams. After Adams won the vote in the House and became president, he named Clay the Secretary of State. In the past, secretaries of state had often gone on to become president. Although the election was decided properly according to the Constitution, Jackson and his backers were furious. They accused Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain and stealing the election from Jackson. The anger of Jackson and his supporters seriously hampered President Adams' efforts to unify the nation. Reading check. Draw conclusions. Why did some people refer to the 1824 election result as a corrupt bargain?
Okay, what happens after is Andrew Jackson supporters do everything they can to make the president's job hard. And I will start the second video, the second recording for the chapter on this section. So this recording I'm going to be covering in class, and the next recording I am going to be having you guys do yourselves. All right, that's it for now.